Hey everyone, welcome to my full in-depth guide to Azir. In case you're new to the channel, I'm a multi-rank 1 challenger mid laner and I played pro play for 4.5 years. In this video, we'll break down everything you need to play Azir and clear up some of the misconceptions that people have around him, so let's get into it. So one quick thing I want to talk about is when to pick Azir and kind of clear up a misconception that people have. So in the past, Azir was a DPS champion that could be built poke if needed, whereas I think now Azir is more of a poke champion that can be built DPS if needed. So Azir is very well rounded. He has a variety of item builds, runes, etc. that allow him to pretty much adapt to any situation, and he's very blind pickable. So for the most part, you can just pick Azir whenever you want. But I just want to bring that up because I think if you are using him purely as a counter pick, there are better champions at killing tanky teams at the moment. But I think Azir really excels against squishy teams, especially ones without sustain, where you can just kind of poke them from range over and over. So I just wanted to bring that up. We'll kind of talk about this more throughout the guide, but I think people really misunderstand that and still think Azir is like that really big tank buster, but he's not really like that anymore. He's definitely more of a poke champ. So let's get into the runes next. So runes on Azir, there are a variety of options and it can be very overwhelming, so I'll try to explain them all for you. In my opinion, the best page at the moment is First Strike. I think the reason this is so good is because it's very easy for you to always get the first hit. It helps you scale towards your one item where you spike really high, and also it does provide you a fair amount of damage in the laning phase still, maybe not as much as some of the other laning keystones, but I think overall this is kind of the best keystone at the moment. That being said, the keystones are quite situational, but if you're just defaulting to something, I think it should be this. When it comes to these minor runes, you can honestly change a lot of stuff. You can take magic boots. If you want a free stopwatch, like that's fine as well. In here, your two options really are Biscuits or Futures Market. I think like if you're really trying to rush Lost Chapter, like Futures Market can be good. Otherwise, probably Biscuits will be good. DMATs don't really do much for you on Azir, so I wouldn't really recommend taking them. I guess the one exception would be if you're versus a roaming champion and they're trying to roam on cannon waves, you could demat their cannons, but normally Azir has push in most matchups, so I don't see much reason to take it. And then down here, I'd say if you're in a skill shot heavy matchup, Corrupting Pot with Time Warp Tonic is a very powerful combination. That being said, this is being nerfed in a couple patches, so it might not be as good then. Cosmic Insight, of course, very good if you can get away with it. Summon a Spell Haste is always very nice. So for your secondary runes, again, there's a variety of stuff you can take. I think if you're going for First Strike, you're really going for scaling. So in my opinion, you should really lean into the absolute focus, Gathering Storm. Just go for as much greed and as much scaling as you want. But it's perfectly fine to take like Mana Flow Transcendence if you want. It's also fine to go Precision and take out like Alacrity and Presence of Mind, which can be quite good as well. I guess there's like some other stuff you could do. Like you could take the Domination tree and take something like this, but I think if you are going Domination, in my opinion, it synergizes with the other keystones a bit better. So I would say if you're taking First Strike, probably go with this, but know that there are other options that exist. You know, if you really want attack speed for some reason or extra mana, you know, there's like a variety of things you can take, and I wouldn't worry too much about like taking the perfect runes here. Like they're honestly all quite good. So for your second or for your minor runes down here, I think you should always take attack speed. That's pretty important on Azir. Obviously take the adaptive shard and then armor or MR, just depending on the matchup. If you don't know what you're against, you can take health and that's fine as well. Okay, so that's the first strike out of the way. Next, we have the two sorcery keystones. So this is Comet and Airy. Now, this is if you just want to win your lane as hard as possible, and there's a couple different things you can do with this as well. So if you're just wanting to crush your lane as hard as possible, which is definitely like a pretty good idea on Azir. There are a lot of champions that can't really survive you in lane. One thing that people don't understand is that Azir's lane is extremely strong. I think he's weak in the early game because he's weak at skirmishing, but this is not the case. Azir's lane is probably the best out of any mid laner in the game, or like at least top 3. So if you're against a ranged champion, you can take Comet, and we'll talk about this in the laning phase, but it's very easy to guarantee Comet hits if you use W in like the WQ combination to get the slow and then hit them with Comet. You can also take Airy if you're versus a melee champion, and that can allow you to bully them a lot. I think that in general, if you're versus a melee champion, you should probably be taking First Strike instead. But like, yeah, if there are melee champs that you can really bully out, you can go this. But I think against a lot of range matchups, especially other ones that have a lot of poke in the laning phase, champions like Orianna, Victor, stuff like that, Comet can be very good, and it makes a difference in these matchups. I think, again, if you are going for this matchup, or for this keystone, it's really so that you can crush your lane. So I think for that, taking the kind of runes that help you do that is really good. So you can even consider Absolute Focus if you want, but I think having Scorch is really important. Also, depending on what you're against, you have some options. So Cheap Shot is actually pretty good on Azir because you always slow them with your Q, which allows the auto afterwards to do a little bit of extra true damage. Again, if you're versus heavy skill shots, you could instead go for the Time Warp Tonic Biscuits page. So this is like very early game, either one of these. And honestly, they're really good. I really like these pages, but you do have to get a lot done with it because they just get like very heavily outscaled by having the first strike page. And I think in Season 12, especially with how strong scaling is, it's a bit easier to use First Strike for sure. But if you know you can get a giant lead, then this is fine as well. So another couple rune pages that you're probably not going to use, but have been used in the past, are Electrocute and Hail of Blades. So these are kind of like much better for skirmishing. If you really think skirmishing is going to impact the game a lot, you could look for something like this, or with Hail of Blades as well. I'm not going to go too much into these pages because I don't think they're that useful. And I think the other options are just better, but these used to be taken a lot for early game skirmishing, but I think now there are just better options, so I'll just let you know they exist, but in my opinion, I would never run them. So the final couple ones that we have here are either Conqueror and Lethal Tempo, and I think after Lethal Tempo has been nerfed, it is kind of just better to take Conqueror, but Conqueror is kind of like your anti-tank page. So this is like, we're going like for just like huge extended team fights. We're going to be building items that kind of facilitate this. So I think, yeah, if you're versus a ton of tanks, I would look for Conqueror. Again, this used to be Lethal Tempo, but after it's been changed, it's not really as good anymore. But you see a lot of like Conqueror with like Absolute Focus Gathering Storm because this gives you a ton of extra AP, this kind of combination. Some people run it with Domination, but I'm not really a fan. And I think this is like the best page here for anti-tank. So I guess to kind of summarize it, because again, it is very, very overwhelming. I would say default to First Strike. I think like the First Strike page for the most part is going to be the most consistent. If you really think you can crush your lane, go Airy versus melee and go Comet versus ranged. And finally, if you're against like an extremely tanky comp, look to go Conqueror with the scaling secondaries, and that'll probably be the best for you. So I know it's a lot, guys, and honestly, I wouldn't worry about it too much because pretty much every keystone is good on Azir, but I think if you can optimize it just a little bit, it'll go a pretty long way. Let's talk about Azir's items. So first off, for your starting items, you have two choices. You have the Doran's Ring and Health Potions. So this is if you can bully your lane a lot and if you're not worried about taking a lot of harass back. If you are going to take a lot of harass back, or if you're against a lot of skill shots, Corrupting Potion is a better option. I think, in general, Azir wins most of his lanes and also outranges most of his lanes, so I think Doran's Ring 2 pots should kind of be your default. But there are a lot of matchups where you can take Corrupting Pot in as well, and I think if you're not sure how the matchup is going to go, you should probably just take Corrupting Pot until you know how it's going to go, and see if you actually needed all that sustain. But Doran's Ring is definitely more powerful if you can get away with it. Just in a lot of matchups, you are going to be trading quite a lot and taking a lot of damage, so Corrupting Pot can be good too. Early buys, as with most mages, Boots and Darkseal are kind of the go-to in the early buys. You've got Boots, which are very useful for kiting melee champs, dodging skill shots. They just kind of help with trading quite a lot. And Darkseal, obviously just extremely efficient on basically every AP champion in the game and should be bought, I would say, like 90% of the time. Don't try and force it. Like if it's going to ruin your base, don't buy it, but it is really good, right? So more offensive option, definitely the Lost Chapter. It gives mana and ability haste, so you can just spam WQ on cooldown, which is extremely good for the laning phase, obviously. And outside of your WQ spam, you actually don't have crazy mana costs, I guess, if you use your E, but this can allow you to just keep pushing the wave and keep harassing your opponent. So it's really, really good if you can get this. But obviously 1300 gold is quite hard to get. For your kind of defensive early buys, Merc Treads can be really good against double AP mid-jungle, especially if they have CC. If they don't have CC, I would just recommend buying the Null Magic Mantle. You basically buy this for the tenacity as well as the MR, but if you're not getting value out of both, you can just buy the MR. Now, if you're versus an AD champ, it is kind of hard to itemize. You honestly don't really want to buy Seekers that early in the game because it means that you don't really have enough mana to keep harassing. So I don't normally like buying Seekers. But one thing you can do, especially depending on what items you're going to build after, is buy a Ruby Crystal. So if you're going to buy a Zhonya's second, you probably shouldn't buy this, obviously, because it doesn't build into it. And then I guess you should go Seekers, but it's not that often that I do that. I guess I should put it in. If you are versus like a Zed or something, and you know that you're going to build Zhonya's second, you probably should buy the Seekers. But I think if you can, it's best not to delay your items, your damage items on Azir, because you spike so hard at one item. And if you're planning on building, again, we'll talk about this a bit later, but if you're planning on building an item down here that's situational, that builds out of a Ruby Crystal, it can be kind of good just to buy a ruby crystal at some point in the lane. If you are versus these kind of assassins that really need to snowball. But I think you should try get away with not buying them. Just Azir is very, very strong in the early game anyway. So a lot of the time you'll just be kind of wasting gold, and I think kind of like making up for bad play. So I'm not a huge fan of it, but if you really do need defensive stats, like they do exist, but I think if you can, you should try avoid it. Boot options, there's really only 3, and I'd say maybe even 2 on Azir. So I think Sork Shoes or Merc Treads, for the reason we said before, are kind of the best. Sorks are really, really good on Azir. The Magic Pen is extremely valuable. So I would recommend Sorks as your baseline. If you need Merc Treads, you can buy them. Lucidity Boots, I don't really like. I think the only reason you would buy this is if you really need Summoner Spell Haste, like if you really need your flash cooldown, or if you just have a really awkward base and you don't have enough gold. So I don't really think they're that good, but like they're okay. Like you could buy them, I guess, if you're versus very tanky teams and you were focused mainly on cooldowns instead. One other thing people will probably bring up is Berserker Greaves. We're kind of going to talk about this a bit more when we talk about Nashers and stuff, but attack speed in general is not as valuable on Azir as it used to be, and I think you're going to get more damage out of the Magic Pen anyway, compared to attack speed most games, so I would never really go Berserker Treads anymore. So for your standard build, this is your standard poke build. If you are against like a bunch of squishy champions, this will give you a ton of damage, a ton of poke. And this facilitates a lot of different playstyles. So with like Ludens, Sorks, and Shadowflame, obviously you have just a ton of burst damage. And when you get into the bigger ticket items like the Rabadons, your Shurima Shuffle starts being able to do like a very meaningful amount of damage. So I would say if you're going for this build, like if you're against a bunch of squishy targets, these 3 items are probably just set in stone. And then after that, you can kind of go situational after that. I think if you can pick up Rabadons and Void here, it is good. Like obviously pick up Void first if they have MR, pick up Rabadons if they don't. And then you can kind of round it out with, again, another situational item of your choice. But definitely don't wait to this point to buy Zhonya's if you needed it way earlier, right? Like we'll talk about this a bit more in depth, but if you need Zhonya's second item, then you just buy Zhonya's second item, right? But I think it's generally kind of bad to delay your defensive item, or sorry, your big ticket offensive items into too late in the game because, simply put, delaying a big item like that by 2,600 gold, especially if you don't need it. Like you got to be really careful when you buy defensive items because they reduce your damage by a significant amount. And a champion like Azir that has self-peel, has shielding, and has a lot of range, normally you can get away with not buying defensive items and just like playing better. But obviously there are games where, if you die, you don't do any damage. So sometimes you'll need defensive items, but if you can, you should try not to buy them. Your alternative mythics, there are really only 2. So Liandry's is obviously very, very good against tankier teams. If you are versus a tankier team, something like Conqueror with Liandry's can go extremely hard. It will just give you a ton of extra damage. And obviously it's very, very easy to proc this on a bunch of targets. You can just keep auto-PVing people with soldiers with Q. So very, very easy to hit like a large number of enemies with this. Crown is another one that you can consider. Again, I'm not a huge advocate for Crown in general. I think it's very overrated. And you don't really need defensive items on Azir, like we said. But if you're versus a comp that really just has like 1 or 2 threats, and they don't have a good way of popping the shield, then you can just kind of buy this and become invincible. So it has its uses, but I really wouldn't recommend just like buying it in the majority of your games. But if you look at the enemy team comp, you see that they have like only 1 or 2 threats to you that really matter, and they don't have great ways of proccing this before they go in, then it can just like win you that game. But it's just going to be very situational. You're not going to buy it too often. The situational items, there are a lot of them. First off, Medjai's. Now, Medjai's, it's not amazing on Azir. It's good because Azir is quite long range. So again, it's like pretty hard to die, but you're not going to hit if you're playing Liandry's, maybe this is a bit better, but if you're playing like the poke build, it's oftentimes you're not going to hit a bunch of different targets in a team fight, so you're not going to get as many stacks as you would think. Also, it's like delaying your other items isn't as good, so yeah, I wouldn't buy this that often. I guess if you get up to 10 stacks on your Darksteel and you really feel like you're not going to die, you can go for Medjai's. But I think just sitting on the Darksteel and building your other items is generally better. So yeah, don't overdo it. You also don't get that much value out of the movement speed, but it can be good, right? Next, Shadow Flames. This is a really good second item as we're talking about here. The Fire Magic Pen is extremely good for poking. So this is if they're just like all squishies, they're all low on MR. This can be very, very useful, especially when combined with the Ludens Sorks build. Healing reduction, I would almost never ever build this on Azir. You can maybe build it one in like 100 games, but you're not very good at applying this to a bunch of different targets. And yeah, you just in general don't really want to be buying this. You can get more damage out of buying other items. So you can buy this if literally no one on your team is buying healing reduction, but I really think you should try skip it if you can and only really buy it if it's absolutely necessary. Now next we have Demonic and Rylai's. So this is kind of like your your second item slot. So these could replace Shadow Flame, and I think they kind of fit in more with the Liandry's build. So you might see something like Liandry's Demonic or something like that. Like that's very common against tankier targets. I'm honestly not sure how good these items are. I feel like Rylai's is somewhat overrated on Azir. I feel like you already have pretty good tools to kind of deal with melee champions, and you have a slow already, so I'm not a huge fan of Rylai's, but it is very cheap, and it gives like reasonable stats. So you kind of can build this as your second item, I guess, if you were, or even as your third item if you went like Liandry's Demonic Rylai's or something. But I think at that point you might as well play a different champion like Swain or something, you know, that kind of like fits that a bit more. So I'm not really a huge fan of that. I think Demonic second, it is good. It does scale quite well, but it's not that great actually at 2 items. So it's like, it kind of fits the role of your second item, right? Because if you're buying Liandry's first, it's like, okay, what else do we build against tanks? Really, the only other option is Nashor's. So we kind of have to go Demonic second, but it doesn't actually do that much damage as your second item. So it's like you're definitely investing in the late game for that of something like Liandry's, Demonic Rabadon's, Void Staff. You know, so you're really investing in the late game. So I think like as your second item, it can be bought, but just bear in mind that your spike at 2 items with Liandry's Demonic is much, much worse than Luden's Shadow Flame, which is another reason why I'm not a... It's good, right? Like if you're versus tanks, this is probably what you should build. But in general, I feel like this is like delaying your spike for so long, and it's gonna take you a while to affect the game, and especially at that point in solo queue, like 2 items where stuff like third dragon is starting to be quite important. Like being spiked for that is really, really important. So again, this is like good for against tanks, but just bear in mind it's like very, very strong scaling. So other second items you can pick up are Zhonya's or Banshees. So like if instead of Shadow Flame, you could buy Zhonya's or Banshees. I would say if you're buying a defensive item, just replace Shadow Flame and don't build Shadow Flame after. So don't go like Luden's Sorks, Zhonya's Shadow Flame, because at that point you're just delaying these 2 items here until too late in the game. But if you need one of these, you can look to buy it. I think both Zhonya's and Banshees do have a place on Azir. Again, it can be quite hard to proc the shield for a lot of people because you're very long ranged. And Zhonya's can be sort of useful if you're going for a lot of Shurima shuffles, but also like for Shurima shuffles, you kind of need a lot of flat AP. So yeah, I don't know. They have places, but then they shouldn't feel super amazing. It's more just like, you know, if you're against something that's going to dive you that's sort of unavoidable, something like Zed or Kayn, we can look to pick up a Zhonya's here instead. Or if you verse a ton of AP or some spell that you really need to avoid, Banshees can be a good option as well. The last item we have here is Nashor's. Now, Nashor's is a pretty good item as well, but it just doesn't really fit that well into the build. Like, if you're going for the poke build, it doesn't really make much sense to buy Nashor's, right? Because you're not going to spam autos on them. You're really just building for that poke and that burst. The attack speed doesn't help you that much. Then, on the other hand, if a lot of the anti-tank builds, like, you know, when you're versing a lot of the tanks in the meta, there's not that many of them that you actually just get to stand there and auto attack a lot. So this is one of the reasons why Azir is not really a DPS champ anymore, is when Azir came out a long time ago, and you used to just be like autoing a front line from behind your front line. Basically, you were just standing there putting orders in like that. But against the tanks these days, a lot of them just have a ton of CC. You know, if you think of something like an Ornn, it's like, are you just going to stand there and get to auto attack? Well, no, you're probably going to get ulted. You're going to have to move. Then he's going to try and knock you up. You're going to have to move again, and then he's going to like stun you with his W. So it's like, it's very rare that you just get to stand there and just like hit people with autos like over and over. If you do versus like that sort of comp where you can just like dump autos into them, then yes, this is quite good. But I think, again, that anti-tank, the best kind of option is Liandry Demonic. So yeah, that was a lot to take in, and it's probably pretty confusing, but to kind of summarize it for you, I think the best build, especially if you're versus a squishy team, is to go like pretty much this: Luden's, Sork Shoes, then either Shadow Flame or defensive items, Rabadon's Void, and then, you know, just like round it out with whatever last item is kind of good here. And then if you're versus a tankier comp, I would recommend taking Conqueror, going like Liandry's, probably still Sorks, Demonic, and then after that you can go like, again, just like Rabadon's Void build after that. So really, the only things you really need to remember are you going like Luden's Shadow Flame, or are you going Liandry's Demonic? So that'll kind of simplify things a bit for you. But yeah, there's like a lot of stuff you can do with itemization on Azir, but I think you're basically like 99% of the way there, as long as you just remember like versus squishies, Luden Shadow Flame versus tanks, Liandry's Demonic. Fortunately, after the complexities of items and runes, the sums on Azir are pretty basic. You're pretty much always going to be taking Flash TP. It allows you to punish the lane phase a lot. And there's just like not that many other great options. If you're versus assassins, you can look for something like Barrier or Exhaust. Which can be pretty good because a lot of these champions, they don't really scale that well. So if you have something like Flash Exhaust, it can make things really hard for them. But just bear in mind, it scales better for sure. Like it's very hard for them in a team fight, but it's a lot worse in the laning phase. The only time Azir really has mana issues is in that very early game, and teleport can help a lot with that. So not having TP early, a lot of the time, if you do take one of these sums, you can find it sort of difficult to lane. Just by them kind of like out-sustaining you either with their HP or with energy or something like that. So yeah, but those are options. Another thing you can take is Cleanse if you really, really need it. I think most of the time you don't really need Cleanse. You can just go Merc Treads instead, and that'll allow you to still take Flash TP. But I guess if you really needed it, you could take it, if you're against something like Lissandra and you didn't want to build Mercs for whatever. Yeah, I guess like maybe that's an option. So yeah, you can take that. You can also take Ignite, but it's just very hard to use this on Azir because it's not that often that you will actually be in range of people. But if you're versus some kind of melee champion that you're going to fight a lot, so something like Sylas, where pretty much like whenever you're fighting them, they're going to be on you, right? You're always going to get the opportunity to ignite them. So then that can be useful, but I wouldn't take this unless you're very sure you can get kills with it, because normally Ignite scales quite well because it's just like a bunch of extra true damage for team fights later. But Azir just has a really hard time in team fights actually putting it on someone useful compared to like a champion like LeBlanc, where they can kind of just dash in and ignite whoever. So yeah, I would just say stick to Flash TP. Against assassins, consider a defensive sum. If they have a ton of CC and you don't want Mercs, you could take Cleanse. Finally, you could take Ignite versus some melees, but not super useful in my opinion. So Azir's abilities, they're not super crazy. Starting off with the passive, you can resurrect dead turrets. Now they can't be Nexus or Inhib turrets, but it can be anything else as long as the turret is dead. And the way this works is basically it just does damage that scales with your AP and survives for 60 seconds and then disappears. People can kill it earlier if they want, but it does take a while to kill it. Also, I do believe that it gains extra resistances when you're close to it and actually loses them when you're far away from it. Yeah, so see here, when you're close to it, it gains a lot of extra armor, but when you're far away from it, it loses it. So you there's a couple ways you can use this. You can use it to either make sure a lane is pushed. So like, for example, if you have dragon spawning soon, you could quickly go top, place the turret, and that'll make sure that next wave pushes, and then you can still walk down a drag. Another way you can use it is you can kind of use it for defending towers. So like, for example, if the enemy wants to siege your tier 2, it could be a really good idea to place your turret on the tier 1, and then you can kind of play there for a while. Another way that I find quite useful to use this is when you're using Baron. So a lot of the times when you're using Baron, you have to push really far up in the lane and you don't really have a lot of safety. But if you place your turret like on their tier 2 tower, then like when you're sieging their tier 3, it always gives you a spot that you can kind of position back towards and make it difficult to dive you. So while this looks quite simple, and I think a lot of players don't really care about it that much, it actually does have quite a lot of uses to it. I think especially when you're using Baron, it can get you a lot of value. So onto the actual abilities. First, I actually have to start with W because basically everything else works with this. So the W passively gives you attack speed, and it gives you more when you put more points in it, so you just get a lot of attack speed for free. And when you have 3 or more of these sand soldiers down, you get additional attack speed. And the active, the way this works is you just W and it places a sand soldier for 10 seconds. It does have a range, as you can see, so you can't place them super far away. And then when Azir attacks an enemy near the soldier, it orders the soldier to attack, which deals magic damage. So that's pretty nice. It means you can essentially extend your auto attack range. So even though I can only auto this target from here, if I place my W here, I can actually walk a bit further back and you can kind of extend your auto attack range like that. So this is what makes Azir so difficult to play team fights and lane phase against, is this extra range, it's very, very difficult for a lot of champions to kind of close that gap. So that really kind of can't be underestimated. It also has 2 charges. So if you place one here, you can place another one immediately after if you want, but then of course you have no charges. Let's go to the queue. So the way this works, it orders all sand soldiers to kind of move forward, deal damage and slow the target. So for example, if I want to queue here, you can see the range. They move forward. It does damage even without auto attacking them. But you can often like weave it with an auto attack. And again, this is what makes Azir so devastating in the laning phase, is that you kind of have this like really strong training combination of being extremely far away, being able to guarantee like WQ for the Comet proc and an auto attack. So you can see all this, like look how much damage that does. It procs Comet, Scorch, as well as Cheap Shot if you have that. So it's a ton of damage, and also it's not super costly. Like if you look at this just as a trading combo, it's not that expensive. So once you get mana, you can actually just spam this over and over, and it's extremely difficult to deal with. Next is the E. So what this does basically is you dash to one of your soldiers and you gain a shield and you deal damage. So this is another really good trading tool, but it does require you to kind of fully commit. So if I just show you, you can place your W wherever you want, and then your E will just go towards the one that you're kind of closest, I think your mouse is closest to. So for example, I'll just show you what I mean. Like if you have more than one W down, let's say I have a W here and a W here. If you want to make sure you go to the top one, you just have to make sure you're E-ing like towards that one. Like put your mouse towards that one and press E towards it. So as I was saying, this can be quite a powerful trading tool. As you can see here, it does deal damage to enemies you pass through, but it also like stops you when you're passing through. So for example, if I want to go through this guy, you can see it kind of stops you, but again, deals damage and gives you a shield. One other thing I think a lot of people don't even know is that if you hit a champion, you gain an extra charge. So you can actually place W again immediately after. So that's like really nice. Obviously for looking for all-ins in the laning phase. It can of course also be used to escape ganks. You know, if you just have a W charge up, you're very difficult to gank because you can always just like E away. It can be quite useful for getting back to your tower. And then as you guys probably know, you can combine this with your Q to get really, really big distances. So what you can do is you can use your Q while you're in the middle of your E in order to extend the range. So this is very, very costly on mana, so it's not something you should use too much, especially in the early game. But there will be times for it. It can be used to jump walls. It can actually be used to jump walls even without pressing Q, so that's really useful as well. But you can use this to honestly do some like really crazy stuff. Like you can, you know, go over multiple walls, and there will be combinations with your ultimate as well that we'll talk in the combos section. So just know there's like a variety of ways to use this. I think the most effective ones are either for escaping ganks or for trading, but as long as you know basically that all you need to do this is to have a W down somewhere, and the fact that if you just Q somewhere while you're in the middle of your E, that you can extend or change the direction, basically all you need to know for it. So the last one is the ult. You summon a wall of soldiers that knock people back, they deal damage, and also they block enemy paths, so it's like very annoying for them to walk through. Now, the way this works is it knocks people back, but it actually starts from behind you. So if, for example, you cast this in front of you, see, obviously it still hits, but you can also cast this from in front of someone and it'll still hit them like this. So that's kind of important to know because it's sort of difficult sometimes, like if someone's like right on top of you, to make sure you get the right angle, but pretty much always you can just hit them anyway. So just like it's quite forgiving in that manner. This is super useful, obviously, for self-peel. Also, later in the game, it does a ton of damage. As you can see here, when you've got max rank in it, it does almost 500 base damage. And when you've got like all your AP and the 60% AP scaling, this will do a ton of burst. And it can really be used to win team fights. So we'll kind of talk about like some of the more advanced combos in a second. But basically, the ways you're going to want to use this, you're either going to want to use it for self-peel in a team fight or as the Shurima Shuffle, which I'm just going to show you right now, but I'm going to talk about in more detail, is like kind of as an engage tool where you can like WEQ and then ult someone either towards your team or, you know, towards danger of some other sort, right? So a lot of ways to use this, and this is like part of what makes Azir's team fighting quite difficult. But overall, I think like as long as you know for the abilities that they kind of like I guess like the main things you need to think about is like WQ is going to be your main like combo. Obviously, if people are in your soldiers, you can spam a lot of auto attacks. Keep in mind WE for like getting away and WEQ. And finally, the alt can be used like aggressively or defensively, and you have quite a lot of options. So for which order to max them in, you want to max Q first, then W, then E, and obviously putting a point in alt whenever you can. You're actually forced to start the game with W, and you should almost always go Q level 2. And at level 3, you have the choice between putting a second point in Q or a point in E. Second point in Q gives you a lot more damage, so you can like win your lane a lot harder, but obviously does make you vulnerable. So if you're versus a very heavy ganker, you should probably put a point in E into at level 3. Otherwise, I think you should try not point E until level 4 and just go like W and then 2 points Q, because that'll give you a ton of extra damage for the laning phase and really allows you to take over. Azir's combos. Now, there aren't actually as many as you would think, so most of them you can kind of just like master in a short amount of time in the practice tool. Obviously, basic laning combo, as we already showed, is to have a W on the ground and then look to just like Q auto. This gives you a ton of damage as long as you can get in the auto, especially if you can combine it with Comet, and if you have Cheap Shot as well. That just gives you so much extra damage in the laning phase, and it's very, very difficult for the opponent to respond to it, so that's going to be your main kind of like lane phase trading tool. If you're looking to all in for the laning phase, you might look to WEQ instead. Remember, that gives you an extra W charge, so you can drop another one straight after. Also gives you the shield and extra damage, so this is very good if you're looking for the all-in or something like that. Next, there are two ultimate combinations. So the first one is just a WEQR, so pretty simple. You're just WEQing to a target, and then you're looking to ult them back into your team. You can make this a little more advanced with flash, so if you need to cover a lot of extra distance, or if you need to kind of create a weird angle, you can look to WEQ and then follow up with a flash ult. So there's a lot of different ways you can do that. Honestly, you can get really, really creative with it. And I think like most of the time, like WEQ and then your ult will be enough, but I guess there are some times where like if you really need to force them in a certain direction, or maybe if you need to follow a flash. So one thing that you might have often is when you WEQ into someone like this, they might immediately flash, and then you might need to flash follow them, right? So just like keep that in mind, especially as you go higher and higher level. It's very common that people just like flash immediately upon you WEQing. And this is pretty important because in the laning phase, WEQR is also going to be your main gank setup, right? So let's say your opponent's laning back here, you might just WEQR them to your jungler or something like that. And this is another reason that Azir is so strong in the laning phase, is that he does have this very hard to react to gank setup. But as I'm saying, it's extremely common that people will flash just straight away. So you kind of have a couple options. You can either just like WEQR instantly, and then you'll probably get their flash for free, or you can look to WEQR and then follow up the flash. So if, for example, they flash, you follow the flash, and then you ult them. So those are kind of the two ways you can use that. So another combo that you can do with your ult that I've actually never seen anyone do in game, but it is possible, and if you manage to do it, well, I'll be pretty impressed. But basically, it's going to require you to have a soldier behind your target. So for example, if you have your W, let's say you're being chased, you've placed W in the lane, they walk past it, and what you can do is you can actually E towards this, and then Q back here, and just spam your ult during your Q, and that can allow you to use your ult, basically. It's basically like going in, ulting, and then still getting out. So I'll see if I can do it here in one try. We'll see if this works out, but you basically E, yeah, so you like E and Q, and then you just like spam your ult as fast as you can during like your Q. So it is pretty hard to do, and definitely something that I recommend you guys try and practice tool, because simply put, the timing is not super easy. And I also think if you can't do this, it's not the end of the world. Like I said, I've never seen anyone do this in game, and I don't think it's like the most replicable thing, but it is super stylish, right? So if you want to make montage plays, that's definitely something you can do. Some other quick things I'll mention are that the W actually does give vision. So if you W a bush, you can see who's in there. And I do believe this works with your Q as well. So if you Q a bush, as you can see, it does give vision of the bush, which is quite nice. Maybe one more thing is an auto Q auto is actually slightly quicker than if you don't do it. So it's not really an auto attack reset, but it is a bit of an animation cancel. So if you see here, like 2 auto attacks does take a fair amount of time to come out. But if you auto Q auto, you can get it slightly faster. So this is kind of important for trading in the laning phase. But outside of that, it's probably not something that you're going to think about too much, although I guess it comes up a fair amount in team fights. So I think that's pretty much it for the Azir combos. As I said before, there aren't a crazy amount of combos to Azir, but they are like reasonably hard to pull off. So I would recommend going in the practice tool and kind of learning some of the harder ones. As long as you can consistently do WEQRs or WEQ flash Rs, I think that'll be pretty much the most important thing for you. Laning on Azir is sort of straightforward. At level 1, you pretty much just want to put your W down in the lane and start auto-attacking. You can also look to poke with Comet at level 1 if you want, like if your opponent walks close enough, but mainly you're just looking to get control of the wave. Azir is a champion that can harass like the enemy champion under their tower really easily, so you don't have to worry about like keeping the lane in the middle or anything like that, because you can pretty much always poke your opponent no matter what. But at level 1, yeah, you're just looking to get that priority. You don't really come online until level 2, which admittedly is not that long to wait for. But once you hit level 2, you really want to be looking to trade with your Q and with Comet. So as long as you can kind of combo these things together, you can see I'm playing very aggressively around the creeps. And when they move up, I just look for that WQ auto attack. And that gives like a ton of extra damage, obviously with the Scorch, with the cheap shot, etc. You won't run that sort of thing every game, but if you're running like first strike or something instead, it'll still be the same. You'll be wanting to trade around your first strike cooldown instead. So that's pretty important. And you can see like this damage is very unavoidable. Like as long as you use it at correct times, like when your opponent's going to CS or something like that, it's extremely hard to avoid. And you can play basically any matchup like this. So particularly against like range champions are very strong. You can see here I went the 2 points Q. If you're against a melee champion, then like if you've watched my laning guide, you'll kind of know that you need to keep the wave like more on your side. But against like these range champions, you can basically push as much as you want. One more important thing is that after level 6, you're kind of going to want the wave a bit more on your side, maybe just so you can set up ganks, but I'll show you an example of that in a bit. So basically just your pre-6 laning is pretty much always going to be the same. You're just looking to harass with the WQ every time you have your Comet up. And as long as you do that and don't really time it badly, it's going to be very hard for your opponent to dodge and it'll really stack up. And this is why if someone is playing against Azir and they don't have the right runes, you know, if they don't have, say, Time Warp Biscuits and Teleport, it's going to be very hard for them to survive the harass. Because as you can see, this guy's already used like all 3 corrupting potions. So yeah, you're basically going to do this, and this is always going to allow you to build up a pretty significant lead by your first base, just because like your laning phase is so strong. One thing you might need to be a little careful of is if you're against a champion that has tons of sustain. So let's say you're playing against like a Vladimir maybe, but Vlad's early sustain isn't that crazy, or maybe like an Aurelia or something. You need to just be a little careful about wasting your mana versus these champions. Like definitely don't run out of mana and then not be able to reset or anything like that. But against most champions, you are going to have no trouble poking them out of lanes. That's kind of how your pre-6 laning is going to go. One of Azir's greatest strengths is his gank setup, and pretty much if your opponent doesn't have flash, they're always going to be a free kill, because simply put, like no matter where they are in the lane, there's not really any kind of distance that's enough to respect Azir's ult. So you really want to be looking to like ping assistance on your lane, and this is like one champ where timing the enemy's flash cooldown is actually quite important. Like normally I think, yeah, it's nice, but it's not game breaking or anything like that. But with Azir, you really need to know the enemy's flash timer, because anytime they don't have flash and you have ult, it's pretty much a free kill if you just WEQ them and then ult them towards your jungler. When you play against melee champions, for the most part, the early game is going to be similar. You can harass these champions a lot. Like even a champion like Akai that has something like Fleet Resolve, you can still harass them quite a lot. But most of these like melee assassins or melee champs in general, they become very strong at level 6. So once you get to level 6, if you are against like these sorts of champs that have very strong all-in, that's when you kind of need to let the wave come to you. So you can see here, I'm like still looking to poke, but I'm not playing as aggressively as I would before. And I kind of just want this wave to come to me, because again, most melee assassins, they really struggle with laning or like on your side of the lane. You know, if the wave is frozen outside your tower, they can't really farm or anything like that. So if you've watched my laning guide, which I highly recommend you do, this should be nothing new to you. But I think like the biggest kind of complaint I see from people that just like don't understand these sorts of matchups is your kind of time to really take over is in the early game, in that like pre-6. And then after that, like your wave control is super important, because if you play aggressively versus these champions at this point, it's going to be very, very hard for you. And I'd say that's like one reason why assassins are sometimes considered counters to Azir, because it's like, one, while you do really heavily outscale your opponent normally, it's like you want to create a big lead in the laning phase, and after 6 it kind of becomes difficult to do that. But you should never really fall behind versus these champions. It's more that maybe you wouldn't get ahead or as much as you'd want to, but as long as you manage your wave in the correct way, you shouldn't really have any trouble surviving against these champions, not with like your ult, your W, your E, everything like that. Finally, I'll show you one more example. So this isn't a great example if I'm honest, but one thing I kind of want to show you is that when you're playing a champion that has a fair amount of sustained damage, it's more about your opponent's position in the lane as opposed to your cooldown. So let me just explain what I mean by that. So on some champions, it's like you can all in if they're below, say, 50% health, or if they're below 70% health, or something like that. But when you're playing a champion like Azir, where you have a fair amount of sustained DPS, you know, you've got your soldier auto attacks, your other abilities like your Q, they're not on a super long cooldown. Like realistically, you can get a couple of them in. Even if your opponent is very high on HP, it's more going to be about their position in the lane. So because you have like all this ability to like take an extended trade, as long as they're up far in the lane, that gives you a lot of time, right? Because it takes them a long time to walk back to their tower. Whereas like if they're close to the tower, even if they're very low, it can be kind of hard for you to all in because you still kind of need that extra time. So if someone does walk this far up in the lane versus you, you can pretty much just always ult them. And as you can see here, I'm able to get like a lot of autos in and even a second Q off. So again, really not the best example, but I just want to show you guys that when you are playing champions that have kind of like more extended DPS like this, the position in the lane someone is when you go to all in them is more important than the HP it's at. It's not like when you play certain assassins and you really need them to just like reach a certain HP threshold and then you can all in them no matter what. If you're playing a champion like Azir or Cassio or anything like that, it's much more about how far they are up in the lane, and if someone is far up in the lane without flash, you can almost always all in them. Azir's team fighting. So if there's one part of this video I want you guys to pay attention to, it's this one. I think that for the most part, Azir is honestly not that hard, but Azir's team fighting is where like all the difficulty of the champ comes from. Azir's team fighting is extremely difficult, so I'm going to show you guys a few examples, but first I want to talk to you about kind of like what are the key things. So for the most part, as Azir, you will want to be just like poking down, kind of like making sure you're hitting the right targets, you know, doing the stuff that all the other champs do. But the thing that makes like the difference between like the good Azirs and the great Azirs is knowing like when to go in and use your R. And I think like this is definitely, if you're like a noob Azir, you probably go in too much. And if you're a good Azir, someone like, you know, someone really good at Azir, like BDD, they go in at just the right moments and they really win the fight. To kind of simplify things for you, generally you want to go in with your ult when that sort of ends the fight. Not when you're going to clean up the fight, like not when everyone's already like 1 HP, but when you can kind of push people into your team and that will just decide the fight. Because the thing is, because you have like a fair amount of DPS and you have like reasonably low cooldowns, it's like, if you keep fighting over the fight, you can put out a lot of damage. And the moment you go in, if you like go in, use everything, and then die straight after, you become extremely useless, right? And now there are other champions where, let's say a champion like Zed. If Zed goes in, uses all his cooldowns, kills a squishy, and then dies, like his job's kind of done, right? Because like he doesn't provide much after his cooldowns are gone. But Azir is not a champ like that. Azir will always bring damage by being alive, but also has the ability to just instantly win a team fight if you go in at the right time. So yeah, a lot of it is going to come down to how well you kind of recognize that timing. You can just use your ult defensively to peel, and I will show examples of that. But every single time, I want you to kind of just like look at how I play and look at like what timings I kind of go in. So you'll see in this fight here that I start out by kind of like looking to DPS the front line here. And then when it looks like suddenly the fight can be instantly won here, that's when I go in. So you see what I mean? So this is kind of a smaller example because it's just like a river skirmish, which is what I wanted to start with. But that's kind of like that, and like a microcosm is how your fights are going to look. It's going to be you're poking until the right moment, and then when you can decide the fight instantly, that's when you go in. So another example of this, you can see I'm walking to the fight. This fight, they're already overcommitted. They're already extremely far up, and so just with the WEQ flash R, you just like instantly win this fight for your team. And because you know they've already used their cooldowns and anything, there's just like nothing else for them, right? So just able to pick up a bunch of quick kills here. I really want to emphasize this, that when you're going in like this, you have to win the fight like at that point, because you're just gonna pretty much instantly die after, because you've committed like everything to getting in and you have basically no way of getting out. Paying attention to what cooldowns have already been used is also really important, because a lot of the times, if people use their cooldowns before you get there, you can basically play as aggressively as you want. And you might just use your R to like self-peel anyone off you. So like here, they only had a couple people left with cooldowns. I could just save my R for them. And other than that, I'm just kind of free to DPS, and they don't really have like many tools of dealing with me. So like if you come late to a fight, like it's obviously not ideal. But another thing to kind of like think about a lot are those cooldowns, because a lot of the time, again, like if we're talking about like that timing to go in versus just poking, once they use a lot of their cooldowns, it's a lot easier for you to go in, or it's also a lot easier for you to just save your ult for the key cooldown that they have left. You know, if they've used most of their engage, they only have one thing left, and as long as you save your ult for that, you're free to DPS the entire fight. So here's another example. Again, like what I normally talk about in my team fighting videos is like which of the like targets in the enemy team are the most important. Like that's something I always say. If you watch my team fighting guide, you'll know I like try and number the targets 1 to 5. So one thing you can consider like when you're going in is like who those important targets are, and is there a way to instantly end the fight with them. So like here, the Draven is extremely fed, right? So I know if I can find an ult onto this guy and to this Lux that's also fed, it's very easy for me to just instantly win the fight here. So because I've pushed like all the damage away from me, it's now like extremely free for me to just order from the other side of my wall, and see how despite the fact that I have no flash, and I've committed all my mobility. Like, see this? Right now, I'm as in there as you can get, and I have no way of getting out, but there's no threat left to me because everyone's stuck on the other side of my wall, and I'm still full health. In fact, the only damage I've even taken has been from an ignite. So this is like really, really important because... And honestly, it is just the hardest thing to learn about Azir, because if you do this the wrong time and you instantly die, then you just become like a liability to your team, right? But if you do this at the right time, you basically instantly win the fight for your team. So I am going to show you a couple examples of when you just might be DPSing front to back, but I really want to emphasize that the like biggest difference and the highest level of mastery to Azir is that finding that moment between like just DPSing and like actually going in and winning your team the fight. So let's take a look at this example here. This is one where I basically just front to back DPS because I don't see an opportunity to get to their backline, and I can just DPS from like behind my front line and like pretty much just use my ult for self peel, right? So here they're kind of all moving towards me. I just kind of ult to keep this Jarvan and Jax off me, and then it's just like free auto attacks. I basically just get to hit them for free. I don't really have to commit anything. Once again, staying full HP. So this is why I think like a lot of the time defensive items are overrated on Azir, because if you play well, like you have the tools to keep yourself high on HP, right? So this is like, yeah, this is a good example. It's really important, just like to re-emphasize it, don't overforce. Like if you can't find an opportunity to get on their backline without, you know, dying or kind of like risking yourself too much, it's perfectly fine to backline DPS like this, right? Because you're pretty good at that too. It's just like situationally, there will be times to engage, and like, don't worry guys if it's like really hard to recognize, because this is the hardest thing about Azir, and honestly, it might even be one of the hardest things in the game. Like this is, in my opinion, extremely difficult, and I'll just try and keep giving you examples and make it a bit easier for you. But yeah. So I'll show you one last example from a pro game I played. So as you can see, this doesn't look great. We're down about 6k gold, we're down a bunch of dragons, and I start the fight on half HP. But because I'm like over the wall and can keep DPSing, I managed to like find a lot of damage and then kind of just like find the window to clean up the fight. So you can see here, now this is really important. If you can find an opportunity to DPS from like behind a wall or something, that makes you extremely safe, especially with your ult as well, because anyone coming over the wall is going to be very telegraphed, right? And you can easily ult them back. So here I pretty much just get to free hit from over this wall, get a lot of damage out in the team fight, and then like my team kind of overcommits a bit, but I managed to kind of bait them in, and I take my opportunity to go in on Ori. So let me just show you what happened here. So what happened is I started walking up, and it was very clear to me that Ori was going to try flashing me here. So I managed to bait out her QW, right? And then because she's used all her cooldowns, now is the time for me to ult in, right? So before, where you might be thinking about, you know, people's mispositionings or stuff like that, the cooldowns are also really important, right? So she's used all her damage abilities here. I know she has no ult. I know she has no QW. So this is my time to go in. I get the ult on her. Seraph's shield, God bless, and I managed to clean up this fight. So this was one where we were extremely far behind, but because I played it well, we did manage to kind of clean it up. So I get it, guys. It's a lot to take in. I think team fighting on Azir is very difficult, but I'll try to summarize it a bit for you. So your two kind of choices on Azir are either to just like peel back and DPS and use your ult to peel, which is fine. And your second option is to go in and try to get an ult on the important targets to win yourself the fight. Some fights you will do both. You will start by DPSing and then you will go in. Some fights you will only do one. You will only engage or you will only peel back. So the most difficult thing on Azir, as I've said like a million times, is to recognize like those kind of windows. And I think the biggest like way to kind of think about it, or the best way to think about it, would be just if you find an opportunity onto their carries where you can like ult them and still keep yourself out of danger, that's really ideal. Also, recognize that if your backline is way more fed than theirs, it might be fine just to peel back. Like, you don't really need to engage if their carries don't do any damage as well, right? So yeah, it is difficult, guys, and that's basically the best I can explain it to you. Really, this is something that you just kind of have to get a feel for. I would recommend, honestly, if you wanted to speed it up, I'd actually recommend just watching Azir videos and just like watch even a montage, or like just watch the team fights. You don't even have to watch the laning phase or something like that. Just try and get like as much kind of like repetitions in your mind of like what does your team fights look like, and I think that'll help quite a lot. Lastly, we have the matchup. So there's nothing in very hard. I think Azir in general is extremely strong in the laning phase, and there's nothing that he finds too difficult, but there are some champs that are quite annoying. So obviously harder champs. Now a champion like Akali, you actually bullied quite a lot in the early game, and the reason I've kind of put this here is because Azir, he's very strong in the laning phase, but he's not very strong in the early game. He's not very good at skirmishing. He's a lot like Victor, where he wants like an isolated 1v1, but skirmishes outside of that generally don't go his way. So champions like Akali, they can kind of just like, you know, have enough sustain to just, you know, sort of be even. Like, they'll fall behind a bit, but they're okay. But the problem is, if there are any early skirmishes around mid, then Akali would just like mega outperform Azir. So it's like, would I be scared of Akali as Azir? Like, no, not at all. But it could be sort of difficult for a solo queue game if your team is just going to like fight a lot. So that's kind of the case with a lot of the assassins like Fizz, you know, or Kiana. You can beat these champions 1v1, but they're all going to be much better at skirmishing than you early game. So it's really important that you try and keep that 1v1 as isolated as you can. I think other champs that are pretty difficult, like Kassadin, obviously kind of just gets to scale a lot against you. Even though you like poke him down a lot, you can't actually really force a kill onto him. And he's really good against you in the side lane and pretty good against you in team fights as well because of all of his dashes, so it can be quite annoying. It really is another one that I would say is hard, but it's like honestly not that hard. Like, I really want to reemphasize that Azir's hard matchups, they're just not even that bad because he's really strong. Aurelia will really test your wave control and also your ult usage, so that's really important. If you make a mistake, you can definitely die, and she has a lot of sustain, so it's quite hard for you to kill her, but you definitely outscale her, and you can teamfight pretty well against her, but she can be kind of annoying. There's some like generally, you just like bully like pretty much every mage, and a lot of the mages that actually do decent into 1v1, so like a champion like Victor or Syndra or even Zoe, like all these champions can do okay into 1v1. Like, I'd say 1v1 is kind of a skill matchup, but the thing is, Azir has such strong gank setup that these should almost never be 1v1s. Like, after level 6, they should kind of just be getting ganked over and over, but I'd say in the 1v1 it is just like a bit more even. Some champions, as I was going to say, that can be kind of annoying for you is stuff like Corki. So like, even though you destroy Corki in the laning phase, in the mid game, poke is quite hard for Azir to deal with because you kind of have to stand still to auto attack with your soldiers. I guess it's not as important because you're still more of like a poke build, but just in general, poke is quite hard for Azir, I would say. So yeah, kind of the TLDR, Azir wins like basically 99% of lanes. The ones that I would say are difficult are the ones that are kind of going to force you into early skirmishes and stuff that you don't want. But for the most part, like, this is why I think Azir is a good blind pick. He has mobility, wins most of his lanes, and does well in most comps. Obviously, there are some champs to kind of be careful of. I would maybe consider banning Kassadin. That's maybe the only champ I really wouldn't want to avoid. And I think everything else on the list can be managed either with like smart itemization, smart wave control, or just playing towards your win cons. You know, like if they're very strong at skirmishing, trying to avoid that, or if they're very strong in the early game, just like trying to outscale them or something like that. So guys, that is going to be it for my Azir video. Hopefully it was helpful for you guys. I really think that for the most part, Azir is not too difficult except for his team fighting. I think a lot of people think Azir's difficulty kind of comes from the wrong places. Like, they'll be like, oh, like Azir's lane is really hard to play, or Azir has really tough combos or something like that. But I honestly don't think these are that difficult. I think if you kind of stick to the things that I talked about in this video, hopefully it like kind of made it simple for you and you should be able to do well on it. But the team fighting takes a while. Really, the team fighting is quite difficult. Let me know if you have any questions about the team fighting or anything else in this video. I will be happy to respond to them. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.